Let's go ahead and get started. I am Matt Busche. I'm a developer at Nationwide Insurance. If you want to follow me on Twitter, there's my handle there. So first thing, best time to ask a question is when you have it, so please speak up. I have a lot of slides to get through. If I don't notice you, just start talking and I'll stop. So first, why secure by design? This is not exactly what you should do. This is my experience, things I've implemented, things I've learned. Hopefully there's something you can take away from this. So a lot of text here, by far the most text I'll have on any slide, but the OWASP top 10 between 2017 and 2013 really didn't change. So from 2013, we dropped 7, 8, and 10, and they basically all lumped into number 5, and then we added number 4 and 10. So in the last 4.5, 5 years, we haven't gotten better at mitigating security vulnerabilities. So run through each of the top 10 different ways of how we can mitigate these. So first, broken authentication. So if somebody's trying to log into your website and they log in incorrectly 10 times, what happens? Something get logged, somebody get alerted, do they get locked out? What's happening to your user if they're not able to log in? Now, if you can't log in 10 times, you're probably not a legitimate person that should be accessing the website. Multi-factor authentication. So if somebody can log in, how sensitive is that data? Do they need a second form of identification? So that could be a text message, could be an email, could be some biometric fingerprint, a question that you answer, things like that. What happens if your session expires? When does your session expire? Does it live for 8 hours, 24 hours? Should it only live for 20 minutes? If you have sensitive data, maybe it should only live for 20 minutes. Social security numbers. So SSA.gov, great website. They don't display my social security number. It's mine, so I already know what it is. But if somebody else was logging in, they probably don't need to know your full social security number. And if they did, maybe there's a button that says show SSN for people who are privileged users. Is your website using TLS or SSL? And passwords. Are your passwords salted? If somebody steals your database and your passwords are salted, they probably can't figure out. So they would know the most common passwords, and then if they're not salted, they can figure out what the most common hash is and backtrack from there. So make sure you're always salting your passwords. Broken access control. So here we've got an example going to an admin page. So this is a Spring setup with Spring Security. So if I go to the admin page, what do I see if I'm not an admin? Do I get to view the page? If I do, that's really bad. But if you're using frameworks such as Spring or really any framework, there's a pre-authorized. If I don't have ADM authority, I can't view the page. Broken access control. So on the top, or on the left, there's an example here of a legitimate order I have with Best Buy. 30548 was my order number. I changed my order number to 30549. What happens? Do I get to view somebody else's order? Does it say, we're sorry, the information's not available? Which is, you can have your own opinion. I'd say that's probably a better message than saying, like, this doesn't belong to you. So, don't lead your end users to know more about what you're checking than is needed. Dependencies with known vulnerabilities. So there's a great tool called Sneak, but there's also like Greenkeeper, Black Duck, Version I, a ton of different tools. So I created a project for this. I was messing around with some domain primitives, which I'll cover later. But it scans any public GitHub repo you want. Just sign up on the site, and within minutes it will say, after you've made a commit, if you have a vulnerability, it will tell you. So here it's telling me I've got 3 high vulnerabilities and 1 medium vulnerability with my project. It tells you exactly what the problem is. So the issue here, Jackson Data Bind version 294 has an issue with deserialization of untrusted data. This was part of Spring Framework. So in this case, Jackson has to fix the issue, then Spring has to update. But it will let you know what vulnerabilities you could potentially have in your application. If you have a private GitHub repo, like we do at Nationwide, it's not easy to get hooked into Sneak. You can do it, but it's not free. They have to tunnel, blah, blah, blah. So there's another option called Maven Dependency Checker. So this doesn't tell you what vulnerabilities you have, but it will tell you what the latest version of an object or of a package is. So say Hibernate Validator Right now, the current version is 609.6.0.9 final, and we're on 5.2.4. This was actually from I went to GitHub, most starred projects for the last month, I think, was the max, and I ran a scan on that project. So this is a project that is used by hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and it has a lot of out-of-date packages. Insufficient logging and monitoring. So talked about this earlier. If you get logged out because of invalid attempts, is somebody alerted? Do they know what's going on? If there's a spike in CPU, does somebody get notified? Spike in database usage, something's probably up. If your metrics are 400% higher than they usually are during that day, maybe you're being attacked. You can be proactive, check in on what's happening. Lack of monitoring leads to people not knowing about breaches. Now, I've saw numerous different numbers. 243 seemed to be about the average. I saw between 200 and 279 days to detect a breach. So you could have been hacked in September last year, and you're just finding out today. Usually you find out because someone else said, hey, I got an email that my password was on this site and it came from you. It's not even the people who were hacked that are noticing or realizing that they were hacked. So one of the biggest ones, SQL injection. A lot of you have probably seen this comic before, but the school is calling a mom, say, hey, this is your son's school, we're having some computer trouble. They said, oh dear, did he break something? So she named her son Robert, drop table students. If you pass that through without a query param, drops the students table, obviously would cause a big problem. So she kind of laughs and says, I hope you've learned to sanitize your database inputs. So this is one of the easiest things you can do that will prevent the most common vulnerability. So I won't go back to it, but SQL injection has been on the list forever in the OWASP top 10. It's been number 1 for the last 4 years, and it's one of the easiest things for us to work through. So first example here, updating an agency table. This is not using query param. Set my update ID to whatever the username is that's passed in, where the agency ID equals an agency ID that's passed in. So username can be a string. That could be any string. It could be Bobby tables. It could be anything. If you use a query param, we have the option down here below. We set string to username. Now the advantage here is we're still using just a normal string, but anything will be escaped. So if your username was Bobby tables, that would be the name that would be updated in the database. It's not going to drop your table. So secure by design, it's a mindset. This is a great book by Carol Dweck about fixed versus growth mindset, but it's all about thinking how you can improve your software. So secure by design, it's a concern with your project, not a feature. It's not something we bolt on at the end of the project like we tend to usually do. Good design will help deliver good security. So current state of application development, security team runs a scan after the project is all done. They find some vulnerabilities, project can't release. You scramble to fix these vulnerabilities. You have a SQL injection, let's say. Well, you never wrote a query param on any query on the entire page, so you have 3,000 statements to update. Or you have an XSS vulnerability. You have to go back and update every page. So what can we do to fix this? Run the scans sooner. So after you finish one page in your application or after you take over an application to maintain it, get some scans ran and see what's happening. If they tell you, hey, you didn't use query params on this first page, well, then you use query params on every page after that. You won't have to worry about query params as an issue. You won't have to worry about broken authentication or anything. Hopefully you find it sooner. You're not spending months patching things. Common one, I find myself doing this a lot. Nobody would ever do that. So they say, like, you can't have cookies because cookies can be hacked, all sorts of things. We just say, yeah, but no one's ever going to do that. We only have legitimate users using our website. That's true for the majority of users. Most of them want to log in, view their bank balance, get their insurance documents, do something legitimate, but there's a lot of people who are trying to do bad things to your site. So we've got an example here. This was in the 1850s. A bank in Sweden was robbed. So their front door was locked. So this is the 1850s. There was a key above the door. So robbers opened the front door. So this is similar to like your JavaScript validation. It works fine if it's a legitimate user. So if I'm going to go to the bank and deposit some money, the door's locked, okay, I'll go home. So you have JavaScript validation that says first name is required. It's easy to get past that. You can delete the JavaScript, see what happens. So at this bank, the vault locks were top notch. They couldn't get through the vault locks. There were laws around, or standards around how secure the locks had to be. But the hinges were not top notch, so they broke the hinges, pulled the door off, stole all the money. And the banking laws got changed. Now you have to have top notch hinges. But this is like your server-side validation. If you only have front-end validation, you really don't have any validation. Legitimate users will, of course, get all the errors, fix it. They won't send anything bad to the database. But if somebody's trying to hack your site and they realize you don't have server-side validation, it's obviously a big problem, especially if they can pass down something that maybe overflows the database and they get back a stack trace. Maybe you have the directory structure exposed. They can download your class files. Lots of problems can happen there. So no one would ever do that until it's the easiest way to do it. Then somebody's done it. So cross-site scripting. We've got an example here. So just entered script alert hackers, enter the form, we get an alert that says hackers. Okay, kind of funny, but not really a big deal. It does expose an overall bigger problem. So here, I've entered a comment on a website, great site. If anybody has any website that accepts comments, you get stuff like this all the time. Great blog post, great site. I wrote this blog post like 10 years ago, but thanks. And they have a script tag like this that if it renders on the page, then you as an unknowing user, it's called a stored XSS attack. So in the source code, you would see great site script here. Comment just says great site. It doesn't say the script is being loaded. So I visited this page, just a normal user. Now I have this JavaScript that can run on my page. They can steal my session, steal lots of things. So usually this leads to a second order attack. So we have some random person visited the website, and their goal is to attack a secondary system. So now I'm a user viewing logs, let's say, and that JavaScript file gets downloaded onto my computer. I have admin rights. They're inside the trust boundary of the system. Obviously a big problem. They have all the access I do, which is a lot of access. So how can we fix this? First, we could escape the HTML. Not the best solution, but it's something we could do. So the comment would be great site with an escape script tag. Okay, that's better than exposing us to an XSS vulnerability. First, let's go to another example, though. So there's better ways to fix this, but let's say we have a way we accept orders of CDs on our website. So here, the second CD, my mouse doesn't go over there, but I ordered -1 of that CD. So the total ends up being 1773. So that's another problem in itself. Maybe there's a human getting this order. They grab all three. They're like, why is there a negative sign in front of the one? Why would somebody order a negative CD? They ship all three of these things. And instead of me getting charged $11.25, I actually get $11.25 off my order. So if this was something that could happen, the company loses out on $22.50. So it's a big security problem because you're missing out on profits, but also something that's going to screw up inventories, many things. So how can we fix an issue like this? Obviously, there was just front-end validation here, nothing on the back end. So first, what is a quantity? So in the context of math, it is just an integer, which could be basically any number. If you're using Java or SQL Server, it could be -2 billion to +2 billion. That's quite a range. I would never order negative CDs. Or first, you would consult your domain experts, who would say, well, you can only order between 1 and 50 of this item. So on SQL Server, that ended up being a tiny int instead of an int. And you'd write some code like this, validate rules. CDs must be between 1 and 50. We would return a front-end error that says if CDs are outside of that range. Okay, that's okay, probably how most of us do this today. But there's a better way. A better way is using domain primitives. So an example of a domain primitive is like a Boolean. A Boolean cannot exist as the letter A, or an int cannot exist as the letter B. It can only be an integer, which is a number, or it can only be a Boolean, which is true or false, sometimes null, depending which constructor you used. So all the rules are enforced in the constructor. I cannot create a Boolean with a value of A. If I try to do it, you'll get a compilation error. So if it exists, it is a valid quantity. It's a valid true or false value, a valid string, whatever. So a domain primitive is something meaningful. So that's the most important part. We've consulted our domain experts. They said the quantity needs to be between 1 and 50. So we will never have a quantity existing if it's not between the numbers 1 and 50. And because domain rules are enforced in the constructor, you can't modify it, which means it's immutable, it's thread safe, you can pass it around, nothing bad is going to happen because it cannot be modified. And also, there's a reduced cognitive load if we use the domain primitive. So there's a lot less thinking. Did they validate that this quantity was between 1 and 50? Where was the validation done? Do I need to add it to this other page? So an example of a domain primitive, we've got CD quantity here. So the first thing I'd check, so I pass in CDs, which would be an int. Check that it's not null. So if any of these things fail, it throws an illegal argument exception, so the object will not be created. So there's hundreds of ways you can do this. I displayed 2 ways here. So if CDs is greater than 0, if that's true, or CDs is less than or equal to 50, then we would set CDs into our CD quantity object. So the CD quantity object exists with a CD parameter or argument or value that is between 1 and 50. So this CD quantity can only be between 1 and 50. It's not just an int that we have to validate the rules on. It will never exist anywhere unless it is a valid CD quantity. So performing validations on these domain primitives. So first thing, and this isn't something you would do on every page, but do you have permissions to perform this action? So are you logged in? So that's something you're hopefully doing site-wide. It's not an individual page. Check the length of the object. So if it's a username, let's say, I meant to move my username example up earlier, but we'll cover that. Is the length a valid length? And then if the length is valid, then perform a regex. So it's about 2 years ago, Stack Overflow was down for 10 hours, 12 hours, something like that. What happened was they had a regex they were running that was checking for trailing spaces, and it checked to make sure there was not more than a certain number of trailing spaces, and somebody pasted in like 23,000 spaces into this comments field, hit enter. The regex, which is not smart enough because it's really not meant to be smart enough to do that, didn't stop when it got to 8, when it should have only had 7. It kept going, and it overwhelmed their server. The site was down for a day. None of us could perform our jobs. So the last validation part would be the database. So you might be thinking, well, we're performing 3 separate checks here. If you have a database check that's slower than any Java code you could write, even if you're looping through, like to check this regex 1,000 times, your database call is still going to be much slower than that. So take an example of a username. Username is a string, okay? We've got a min and max length. Valid characters, so maybe you don't allow numbers, certain special characters, things like that. And then finally, a username should be unique, one of a kind. It can't exist in your database already. So an example of the username would be a username domain primitive, min length 6, max length 64. Valid characters are letters, numbers, underscores, and dashes. You can have any number of those as long as it's between 6 and 64 characters. So first thing we would do, we'd check the value is not blank, okay? Since it's coming from a form, it wouldn't really be null. We trim the value. So I use Concur, forced to use that for my work, but my username was stored with a space on the end because I auto-completed it from my keyboard. So I have to log in with the space at the end of my email address, otherwise I can't log in. It doesn't recognize the thing, so poor design by them. So trim your username values, or pretty much every value should always be trimmed. So we check that the length is between 6 and 64, that it matches the pattern. If any of these rules fail, it will throw a illegal argument exception, which should catch on the front end, return an error here, like only letters, numbers, dashes, underscores are allowed, whatever error message you want. And then once you've got a username object, you also have a user object. So inside the user object, we're using our username domain primitive. So this user object will not exist with the username unless it is a valid username that we've verified it is unique between the certain characters, doesn't have invalid characters, any of that. So you might be thinking, yeah, but I always need to have a no-arg constructor in my classes. Simple. I think even like IntelliJ creates one for you by default. You don't need it. Provides no value. Don't do it. There's no reason to do it. So we've got a no-arg constructor, so we can create a car that has no color, no door, no engine. This is worthless to everyone except somebody that works at a car plant. So this would be an example of a no-arg constructor. So we create a new car. There's nothing on it. We have to remember to set the color, set the door, set the engine. If we forget any of those, could get to the factory, doesn't get painted, doesn't have doors, all sorts of different weird things. So we could create a car object that has domain primitives of color, door, and engine. So there's certain colors we allow, certain door amounts we allow, and certain engines that we allow. So we cannot create a new car unless we pass in a color domain primitive, a door domain primitive, and an engine domain primitive, and all three of those get set when it is created. So if you're using Hibernate, you may think you need a public constructor or no-arg constructor for that. You just need a private no-arg constructor. Hibernate uses reflection to populate the data, so if you have a private car here, it will figure everything out, no issues. So also descriptive names. I don't know how many are Java devs. The joke seems to be like every name is super long. So it's like insert producer basic action page. Well, it's better than saying like INS, PDR, and something that's hard to search for. So use descriptive names. So we've got, example here, we have a class of marital status. So if we're going to set somebody to married or set somebody to divorced, there's certain actions that we need to take. So we could have a method that says set married, so then we just say married equals true, or set divorce, divorce equals false. But what if there's other actions that need to happen when somebody gets married or somebody gets divorced? So now, if I'm getting married, I would say marital status dot marry. So then that checks, am I already married? If I am, then it throws an error. You can't get married twice. Then it would set, and if I was not married, it would set married equal to true. Or if you're divorced, say you have to be married before you can get divorced, and then it sets married equal to false. So now if you need to change any of this logic, if anybody gets married, now you need to like send a letter or something like that, you can set values in here, which could then be used in a different system. You don't have to update everywhere that this code is used. But what about having so many classes? It costs almost nothing to create a new class, a new object. Programming languages are really fast, and the database is always going to be your biggest constraint, no matter what. Complexity. You need to have all this logic somewhere, so you could have all your username checks somewhere. I mean, you can't just not write them unless you're allowing anything. So if it's in this username constructor, then somebody doesn't have to look for create new user validation file. They look in the username file, they see exactly what a username is, they know all the rules. If they have to update that, they change the rules in one place. They don't have to go searching at all. Performance, also not a problem. Computers are really fast. Servers are really fast. This was maybe a problem 25 years ago, not remotely a problem today. Hibernate already covered that. It does all of its magic through reflection. So an example of existing code. So here, this was an example we had. So we've got a certificate holder address. We create a blank holder address. Then we set all of these fields. We have to remember to set address 1, city, state, zip. If we don't, then maybe a letter doesn't get mailed. Bad things can happen if we don't set all of these values. So the new code we came up with, created a new constructor inside our holder address that requires address, city, state, and zip to be passed in. Oh, yeah, so this first line is the code that is in the actual service, and then the class is listed next. So we pass in address, city, state, and zip. We set all 4 of those. There is no set city method, set state method. So if somebody tries to call address.setCity, they'll get a compilation error. They won't even compile into an EAR or a WAR file. So there's no way anybody can set those things. If they're trying, they'll get an error. They won't be able to fulfill what they're trying to do. So I ran through a lot of things pretty fast. What questions do you guys have? Nothing? Yeah.
So at like a testing level, I can totally see how you could test those objects really easily.
Yeah.
Do you also need to look at testing at that higher level of getting the request, and then you find yourself testing multiple things? Test it when I type it in, I get the error message. Also test when I construct the object, I get the error message. That's something I feel like I've run into where, depending on where you do the validation, that's not always necessarily where you business logic-wise you do the testing.
Yes. So yeah, he's asking where would we do the testing for all these things: front-end validation, actual unit tests, automation tests, potentially. So I advocate more for you don't. So like the JavaScript check would be that username isn't null, for example, because then you can pass any value to the database, then it fails. So you could write a front-end test, but then you can't actually test the server side because you can't get past your front-end validation. Definitely unit tests. So I would say the majority of your work would be based on unit tests. So if you're using something like Spock, you can set up 40 examples of any variation, make sure everything passes. Then your automation tests, same thing, they would be accepting or expecting any error if they add something invalid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially on the front end part, just testing what that covers, and then try to also test what's deep down underneath.
Yeah. Yep. We used to spend a ton of time doing JavaScript validation, and then all of our server-side code we could never really test, so we relied on only our unit tests to make sure that that worked, which just kind of turned into a mess, especially if you don't cover every path in your unit test, that eventually somebody disables JavaScript, and then they're causing problems for you. Yeah.
So for the last few code examples, do you have any best practices or tools for preventing people from actually adding methods that you're saying you shouldn't add?
Hopefully you're doing a code review, but other than that, it's just teaching, upskilling.
Do you have any resources you can suggest for training someone on these? I've got a team in London that does some breathtakingly stupid things, and I'm not even a developer, but I can see things and I just shut off their web server because I can't believe how dumb it is and how it exposes things. So is there anything you suggest to send and give them an idea of how they should be thinking? It's a pretty junior team that doesn't have anywhere near a senior security-based person to guide them. So what would you suggest?
So is it just poor code or it's insecure code?
It is a fundamental lack of how to build things securely and avoid everything from it. So the breadth of the problem here is everything from running live production data and allowing alteration of it in a test system to this user can't log into the test system that's using production data, so we're just going to disable authorization. It is a fundamental lack of understanding of how to do anything in a secure manner. So, and I imagine that inside their code they have all kinds of problems with this as well.
I would say if you have any security team that could point out some of those flaws, I would think accessing production data in a test environment, like the the firewall config or whatever, like we cannot connect to a prod database through a test server or through a local server. So things like that maybe they could set up.
We have a
It's-
security teams raising flags, but the security team does not have the resources to train them and teach them how to do things. So to them, it probably looks like the standard NASA security team setting arbitrary rules and just putting roadblocks up. So they're legitimate concerns, but they don't understand why they're legitimate concerns. So where do you go to start getting the basic idea of how to code and build and develop securely? How to do all these things? Where can we point them to start? Foresight, I don't know if you have any ideas. So.
I mean, most of this is just from my experience and things I've heard, but yeah, it sounds like education is, they were not probably educated very well. Yeah. Yeah.
So your comment before about not having JavaScript obviously, I'm trading UX for testability. I mean, there are other ways to test your back end without using your front end to test your back end.
Sure, but what value does having every rule in your front end provide to the end user? So if we say your username is required or first name is required and they don't enter something, or they enter invalid characters, I just think from a standpoint of getting things done as quickly as possible, so it could be part of the minimum viable product would be only checking like required fields or this is a number, et cetera. You could go back and add, you could capture all of your server-side errors and see people keep forgetting that username can only be 12 characters or something, and then add a JavaScript check to check that on the front end.
If you go through a workflow though and the user's doing a lot of work to get to that point, then you go to the server and it comes them up and says, no, you couldn't have done this because the first thing that they did. You're trading UX for just testability and convenience of the developer and not thinking about the user to try to prevent them from doing something stupid when you could have helped them right there.
But it should be taking them back to their original page with the first error and all their data. Yeah.
I think it's a good trade-off to say, screw the UX, let's worry about testability.
Yeah, it's definitely not probably a popular opinion, but that's what we've done for some things. But yeah, if you have huge forms, it probably does not make sense to make them slog through a 40-page questionnaire and then send them back.
It'll actually happen one at a time, so it'll happen serially. So if they made if they made 5 mistakes,
Good point.
5 different errors, if they fixed one, they hit the second one, then the third.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You went over a lot of different, problems to solve and techniques to solve them. Have any of these been things that you've been able to, or you try to provide automate feedback or development processes?
No, we just got onto GitHub 4 months ago, so we're still kind of working through how do we set up like hooks and things like that.
Are there any of them specifically that you think would be the best to start with?
Well, I'd say most of them are probably not even the code-related ones. It's figuring out like what kind of monitoring you have. So if you enter an invalid password in prod 30 times, what happens? Does anybody get notified? Or if you F5 the page a ton of times, does it cause any alerts? Or if you run a performance test in prod, what happens?
Do you guys use any automated tools as far as scanning for vulnerabilities or
We have a tool called Qualys. I think that's a publicly available tool. I'm not really sure. We just get a PDF of what's wrong in the end. All right. Thanks, everybody.